Joining us now, a very special guest, former senior advisor to President Barack Obama, Valerie Jarrett, also the author of the new book, Finding My Voice, My Journey to the West Wing and the Path Forward. Valerie, thank you so much for joining us. You know, we must start with this about-to-be announcement, Joe Biden potentially announcing that he will be running on Thursday. You have worked very closely with him during your time in the West Wing. He says he is running as an Obama candidate. By your estimation, how does that work?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to get out ahead of Vice President Biden and make any news. So let's wait and see what he actually does. I can tell you this, Stephanie. I can't imagine in history a closer relationship between a vice president and the president. I know how much President Obama and all of us relied on the wise counsel and advice of Vice President Biden. I think our field already has on the Democratic side an embarrassment of riches, and I'd be heartened to see more folks get into the race.
What's your sense of, everybody wants to know what President Obama is going to do, who he's going to endorse, where he's coming down on these things. Obviously, if you're running as the Obama-Biden candidate, which are words that he said himself, take us into President Obama's mind about these things.
Well, he's met with several of the candidates who are running. I've also had a chance to speak with them. I think that what resonates still is a message that unifies our country, candidates who are authentic, who have a clear vision and an ability to execute, and recognize, as President Obama did not once but twice, that you have to go out there and earn it every single day. I think it's very early in the season. I would remind everybody that when President Obama was running back in beginning in 2007, I think everyone would have said that Hillary Clinton was the inevitable nominee. So a lot can happen. This is a marathon, and I think we're all interested in seeing how each candidate does on the field.
Bernie Sanders is right behind Joe Biden in the battleground states. He's been very clear about it, Medicare for all. You were there, you were a part of it when Obamacare passed. Do you envision health care becoming front and center in this next election, especially given what Republicans are doing to the Affordable Care Act at this point?
I think it should be front and center. I think that we did what we could do to try to craft a bipartisan bill, one modeled after Massachusetts Governor Romney's bill. And it goes a long way towards ensuring that people have access to affordable health insurance. People with pre-existing conditions are covered, 1 in 2 Americans. Women have preventive care. Children can stay on their parents' plan until they're 26. The Republicans have been and continue to take away all those benefits. And I think it is a fundamental right. It shouldn't be a privilege. And I hope it is front and center in the campaign.
You know, one of the things you've learned and that was learned in the Bill Clinton administration is that there are things that are aspirational on the campaign trail, and there are things that actually have to get through Congress, particularly when it's a divided Congress. A number of things that your administration struggled with are being dealt with right now. Gun control legislation. Senator Kamala Harris vows to enact executive action on that. There's student debt forgiveness. Senator Elizabeth Warren is proposing something that came up during your administration. Talk to me about the degree to which Americans should be able to evaluate these proposals as either aspirational or actually doable.
Well, I think they should be both. I think we look to our candidates to have aspirational goals. And the saying is that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. And I think the key is taking those aspirational ideas and trying to implement them. I think what we experienced, unfortunately, were Republicans who just simply wanted to say no and didn't recognize in a big, complicated, wonderfully rich, diverse country such as ours that you can't let perfect be the enemy of the good, and you can't simply say no. That's not what the American people expect. And I think candidates have to recognize that when they're sent here on behalf of the American people, they should try to do the best they can. You inch further and further along towards that perfect union, and sometimes it comes in a big burst the way the Affordable Care Act did, or repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or same-sex marriage. And sometimes you have to inch along the way we did when we had to resort to executive orders because we were unable to get Congress to take reasonable steps. So we'll see what happens. And every American gets to evaluate the candidates by whatever they decide is their appropriate litmus test.
As you take a look at the Democratic Party right now, what does it look like to you? The Twitter universe would tell you that it's pushing further and further to the left. If you watched the town halls last night, it sounded that way. But in the midterms, where you saw overwhelming wins and those candidates who actually flipped states, were moderate Democrats, people who had messages more like Amy Klobuchar. Last week, Nancy Pelosi said, I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is fantastic, but both her district and mine are very far blue, and all you need to be is a glass of water with a D next to your name, and you'll win. We need to get to a more centered strategy to defeat President Trump. What do you believe the Democratic Party needs to look like, or where does it need to lean in order to win this next election?
I think one of the strengths, Stephanie, of the Democratic Party is that we have a big tent. All ideas are welcome, and they're debated, and I think that that's a healthy part of the process. So I wouldn't say, that there is a test that you have to be X position. I think what you want is a leader who has a clear vision for our country, one that looks at creating opportunity, enlarging the pie, making sure that no young person is left behind. And then once you're in office, can you surround yourself with a team that can effectively execute on that strategy and who is willing to compromise for the greater good? And so I don't think you should have just one test in one position that reflects the Democratic Party. I think that what we do is have a vision for our country, and then we move forward the best we can. And sometimes it's incremental, and sometimes it's a burst.
Let me just ask you to get a little deeper into that, because recent polling indicates that 41% of Democrats think the party should be more liberal and 54% think that it should be more moderate. You are, lots of people call themselves strategists, but you really are in terms of understanding strategy. That to me looks like really difficult math. Even if you're a big tent, when you have more than half wanting to go one direction, a little less than half wanting to go another direction, how do you moderate that discussion?
Well, I don't look at it as labels such as liberal or conservative or moderate. I say we're all progressives. And so where do you stand on the issues, specific issues, health care, keeping guns out of the wrong hand, growing the economy, reducing student debt, making sure that every young person gets that opportunity? I think that's the way we should look at the issues rather than just labels. Let's see where candidates fall on specific concrete issues that affect our lives. That's what I'll be looking for, is who's going to make my life and the life of my children and my grandchildren better.
There are factions of the Democratic Party who believe the system should be blown up. They have actually similar ideals in some level to people on the far right. We know there were Bernie supporters.
Meaning like the Tea Party.
Yes,
Yeah.
We know that there were Bernie supporters that stayed home or in some cases voted for President Trump. So this time around, do you actually think those voters could bring themselves to the middle in order to defeat the president, or are we going to fall into that same situation again?
I think the last couple of years has been a real wake-up call, and to the 43% of Americans who did not vote in the last presidential election, I would say to you, we can't afford to have you on the sidelines. The stakes are too high. Elections do have consequences, and we need you involved, and you can't just say it doesn't matter or you didn't get the candidate of your choice. What I'm hoping is that whoever emerges as the nominee of the Democratic Party is able to galvanize and support from the entire party. That's what we need in order to defeat the president, and that should be front and center, I think, of everybody's objective. If we look carefully at what has happened over the last 2 years in terms of attempts to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, walking away from the Iran deal, walking away from the climate change deal, separating families at the border, clear evidence of values that are inconsistent with the core values of America, then I think the challenge is don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Find the candidate who can defeat this president.
Valerie, the book is great. It's called Finding My Voice, My Journey to the West Wing and the Path Forward by Valerie Jarrett, a real insider's look at the Obama White House and Valerie's story. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Allie. Thanks, Stephanie.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.